We owe billions, thanks to 3 letters: PFI, the Private Finance Initiative.
PFI contracts have committed the executive to over £7 billion. Now, to future generations, that's a horrendous figure.
PFI was a way for the government to build things like schools and hospitals today, but pay tomorrow.
They may as well have used a Department of Health credit card and said, build us a hospital.
Some believe it boosted the economy.
In health and schools, we were in a very bad shape. We'd been significantly under-investing. So this was an opportunity to accelerate that investment.
In PFI, the government effectively borrows private money and ends up paying back more using taxpayers' money.
It simply is as stupid as it looks.
Criticisms come from both ends of the political spectrum.
The private sector got all of the upside if the project made more money than expected.
I don't think anybody now supports the PFI idea.
In Northern Ireland, this debt has remained effectively hidden.
When you said 7 billion, I wasn't aware of that.
In the year when payments to private companies hit their highest,
I had no idea it was going to a private company.
Spotlight investigates how the Private Finance Initiative has been used in Northern Ireland. My PFI journey begins with a familiar frustration for many people here, stuck in a queue for the Royal Victoria Hospital car park. For Jim Gray and his 5-year-old autistic son Alfie, these queues last year all proved too much.
I had an appointment for 2:30 that day to bring my son Alfie for a follow-up appointment following from a head operation he'd had. And when I got here to the Children's Hospital, the queue we're in now was probably at least twice as long.
Jim decided he'd try for another car park in the hospital. 20 years ago, the Department of Health, under direct rule from Westminster, tried to improve parking at the Royal with one of our first PFI contracts.
This 2-storey car park has been built not with taxpayers' money but by a private firm. It was the first scheme under the Private Finance Initiative, or PFI, to get off the ground in the NHS here.
A company put up about £3 million of its own money to build the car park. It would also run it, and in return, it would get the money from the meters.
The contract then allowed them to take the profits for car parking for the next 20 years.
For 20 years, they were able to keep all those pound coins and 50p's that people put into the machines.
Millions and millions of pound coins, yes.
Is it down here?
Well, it didn't even come down this far because this queue was actually backed out onto the Grosvenor Road.
Jim eventually gave up and parked outside, but it was all too late.
Alfie was upset. Eventually I felt the best for him was to put him in the car and take him home.
Until now, Jim didn't know that all the money spent on parking ends up in private hands.
I just assumed that the only good thing about it was that your money was going to the hospital.
And you seem quite shocked to find out that that's not the case.
I'm disgusted, yeah. I mean, there were no car parking spaces for me, so I missed my appointment. Whoever owns that car park has nothing to do with the hospital, so they don't need to worry whether or not I got a car parking space.
The company involved is called Car Park Services. At a time when PFI was new, they took the risk of financing, building and maintaining the car park so the hospital didn't have to. But the risk was very rewarding. In a 4-year period at the Royal, Car Park Services made nearly £1 million more than they forecast. In return, they paid the Trust just £40,000 a year. The Assembly's Health Committee has been concerned about excessive profits.
I had to wait 40 minutes to get in, and there's a queue behind me. So occupancy is basically 100%. So that is a licence to print money. A licence to print a vast amount of money every year.
Car Park Services says that the Royal assessed its bid as the most competitive and agreed its forecasts. It wouldn't say what it makes now. This was one of the first PFI deals. Has it been a success?
It has to be one of the worst deals the health service has ever entered into. They could have been making some serious profits over a 20-year period.
Money that could have gone back into patient care.
Absolutely, could have gone back into patient care, could have done all sorts of things.
The Belfast Trust told us lessons had been learned. It added the contract with Car Park Services is ending and the Trust would run the car park in future. Usually, PFI is used to pay for buildings like schools and hospitals. Occasional PFI lecturer, Paul Gosling, gave me a lesson on how it works. He began with how governments normally pay to build things. Historically, how have things like schools and hospitals been funded?
You'd have a contractor came in, would put up the building, and then they'd be paid in full on completion.
So the government paid for things up front. Paul then explained governments use PFI to get buildings without having to find the money first. Build now, pay later.
The government decided instead of borrowing the money itself, the private sector would provide the building. In return, the government are paying for it year by year by year.
But Paul explained that like most deals on credit, paying tomorrow meant paying a lot more.
Private finance initiative contracts usually run for 20, 25 or 30 years at a time, so that it saves the government having to find the money up front, but over the period it pays a lot more.
In Britain, PFI took off under New Labour, but parliamentary reports found it was often a bad deal.
Gordon Brown, he was a great believer in PFI, so whenever Northern Ireland needed extra money, the only thing that he was ever really keen to increase was Stormont's ability to arrange PFIs.
There are 33 PFI projects here. Supporters argue PFI meant investments that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
We were in pretty dire need for investment, whether that was in water and sewage, in roads and health and schools. So this was an opportunity to accelerate that investment in the early noughties. With two very large road schemes, two very big water and sewage schemes, they appear to be working well.
Normally, PFI is used for vital infrastructure projects. But on my PFI journey, one deal jumped out, the only one for offices. As a senior civil servant explained, it's unusual for government to prioritise offices over hospitals and schools.
Governments tend to have higher priorities than office buildings for civil servants and public servants, so we're usually at the back end of the queue.
In 2004, not long before the property crash, the economic development body InvestNI went to the front of the queue for the offices of its bespoke headquarters. This wasn't a school or a hospital necessary for patients or for pupils. This was effectively for civil servants. Was it necessary?
No, it seems that InvestNI clearly thought that it needed a landmark city centre building. It doesn't even occupy all of it, only a few floors. It was a grandiose Quango empire building project from the outset.
InvestNI's current chief executive, Alistair Hamilton, declined to do a TV interview. However, he has robustly defended his organisation's PFI project, saying it was necessary. And we have managed to get hold of a copy of the PFI contract which InvestNI signed with the developer for their new building. And as you can see, it literally runs into hundreds of pages, but at its heart is the principle, the fundamental principle of most PFI deals. InvestNI would get its building pretty much straight away, but without any kind of big, one-off, upfront payment. But when you dig deeper, the contract raises serious questions about value for money. Exactly what was InvestNI getting out of this deal, and how much was it all costing them? Well, first of all, obviously, they were getting office space for their staff. But secondly, as InvestNI themselves have pointed out, the developer would also provide services over the 25 years of the contract. Things like the maintenance of the building, the catering and the cleaning. But in return for that, InvestNI would give the developer £120 million. One crucial difference with this PFI deal, most are like a mortgage. The government spreads the payments out and then takes ownership of the building at the end. But in this deal, the developer would still own the building at the end of the contract. The taxpayer would have handed over £120 million and wouldn't own one single brick.
That is unusual, I would have thought. I thought at the end of most of these things, they actually did transfer.
They normally do.
Yeah, they normally do, yeah. Well, I'm surprised then to hear that the Invest and I wouldn't have transferred then. That is unusual.
Invest and I's Alistair Hamilton said it was understood when the contract was approved that the developer would keep the building and this was the cheaper option.
They are the shop window of Northern Ireland. I don't think you could expect them to operate out of a relative hovel, but when they decided to go for this bespoke building, poured all the millions into it, you would have expected them at the end of it to at least own the asset.
Alistair Hamilton and the Minister at the time, Barry Gardiner, said the cost of the asset was assessed as value for money at the start, using a formula called net present value. Economist Paul Hare says what that means is the total cost of a project can be seen as less than what is actually paid because the payments are spread over time.
The Treasury guidelines do say that you're supposed to use that method of appraisal, look at the costs and benefits of a project over a period.
Invest and I did that appraisal and signed their contract near the height of the boom. But then this happened.
House prices plunging at their fastest ever rate.
So how did Invest and I's rent compare to the market after the crash? Rent for offices is based on a price per square foot. Our investigation stripped out services and looked at what Invest and I were paying for rent alone in 2012. It indicates they paid double the market rent of £12.50, at least £25 per square foot. In fact, higher than anyone has ever paid for offices, the most expensive office rent ever in Belfast.
On the face of it, that doesn't sound like a terribly good deal, no. In fact, to put it a bit more bluntly, it sounds like a disastrous deal.
A problem with many early PFI contracts was inflexibility.
They tied themselves into a 25-year project at the worst possible time. 2004-05, when the market was on an upward trajectory, and then you get to a point of market collapse, and they're still tied in to paying, by that stage, over the odds.
Alistair Hamilton said we were manipulating figures to create a sensationalised story. He said comparing Invest and I's rent in 1 year with what others paid in the market in the same year was a flawed way to assess the project. But Professor Paul Hare, an expert in PFI, said Mr. Hamilton's argument that payments should be discounted because they're made over time doesn't make our comparison unfair.
When the 25 years have passed and you're handing over the developer that money, it won't be the discounted amount, it's the proper amount of money that you're handing over.
The government has to have that money.
Yes, it does.
And it's fair, isn't it, to assess whether this contract is turning out to be value for money?
Totally. Yeah, if I had the contract, I would certainly want to be making that comparison.
The contract was signed under Direct Rule Minister Barry Gardiner. He said he didn't negotiate it, but took ministerial responsibility. Mr. Gardiner, now in the shadow cabinet, said he will be writing to the Audit Office asking for a full investigation into Invest and I's PFI project. That's not the last twist in the Invest and I tale. But first off to my next PFI destination, one of our biggest, the South West Acute Hospital in Enniskillen, which opened in 2012.
Nobody wants to be in hospital, but once I went in there, I felt content.
I thought it was excellent. For a person that likes to be at home, I was quite content to be there.
Because of PFI, the hospital didn't come cheap. Stormont borrowed £130 million and will pay back at least 3 times as much in interest alone over 30 years. The Western Trust, which runs a hospital, says it's in line with the cost of other PFI projects, and the money pays for maintenance for 30 years as well as the construction. The health minister who gave the hospital the go-ahead, even though he says he was not a fan of PFI, was Michael McGimpsey.
When I went into the department, my predecessor, the Direct Rule Minister, Paul Goggin, had the setup done. They were doing it through PFI. I didn't like it.
Shouldn't you have intervened and stopped the PFI completely?
That would have been a very major step to take, and the concern then would have been that this hospital could have gone away for several years.
So what do people whose lives depended on the hospital think? I met a group of stroke survivors, keen to tell me of their experiences and the care they received.
Well, I'm a farmer, and I'm only 42 years of age, and I looked round quick and I could see this like a red flash come down over my left eye.
And I went straight up to the South West Hospital, which took me about 10 minutes from my house. I got a brain scan and a MRI scan, which showed up the stroke.
It's starving the brain, so cells are slowly dying. So obviously the longer it takes you to get to the hospital to get something sorted is what's going to be left of you.
From the perspective of people who live in Fermanagh and Enniskillen, this hospital is very, very necessary.
Yeah. Extremely.
Well, they must have thought that themselves, the authorities, when they built it.
The patients have strong affection for their hospital, but they've no idea how it's been funded.
They went down what's called the private finance initiative route. They borrowed about £130 million from a private company, and they're going to be paying back about £390 million over 30 years.
This is excessive, isn't it? Yeah. Is there no way to refinance it?
Because I've borrowed money plenty more in my time, but that seems a very lot of money to have to pay it back.
I then explained how the money is paid back. There are 2 types of government budget. One's a pot of money for day-to-day costs, like salaries and care, and one's for buildings. But a trick of PFI is that debt repayments for PFI buildings come out of the day-to-day budget.
So you have your pot of money for building things and your pot of money for paying things like doctors' wages, nurses' wages, and for treatments. But that £390 million, Rodney, there's about £13 million a year has to be paid back over 30 years. And that comes out of the day-to-day budget.
Right.
Is there no way? I know.
That's why they're talking of cutting services to pay this back.
And there is a threat to services at this hospital, to stroke services particularly.
Rumour has it that it is the acute services that may be impacted.
Why would you change something that's not broke? If this was happening anywhere else, they'd actually be tapping into what we're doing here and sharing it, where they seem to be trying to be taking it away.
So with the hospital only open for 5 years, there's a threat to key services. And there are other signs it's not thriving. Half the doctors' posts are not filled. The cost of locums has doubled to £4 million. And there's an empty ward big enough for 24 beds.
Do you have a concern that if they took out acute services for stroke, for example, and if they couldn't attract more doctors to come and work here, that such an impressive building could end up potentially as a white elephant?
Yes.
Yeah. Definitely so, yeah.
Because the doctors don't seem to be willing to come.
Whether the doctors come or not, the PFI payments have to be made, come what may, until 2042.
Take this cake here as the health services day-to-day budget. Yeah. Doctors' wages, nurses' wages, treatments, all of the things that are paid for on a day-to-day basis. But this debt also comes out of this budget as well. And the key thing to remember is that that has to be paid to a private company before any other costs are met, before any stroke services are paid for. And I'm wondering whether that makes you feel differently about how the hospital was funded in the first place.
Bad management.
Bad management.
Bad management.
It's a bit like when you go shopping with your credit card. You don't really take much note of what you're spending.
The Department of Health said the hospital was planned to serve a rural population for 60 years. The Western Trust, which runs the hospital, said it had difficulty recruiting doctors for many years and had no alternative to locums. The hospital was one of the last PFI projects in Northern Ireland. With the brand tainted, politicians seem wary. But money for buildings was tight, so time for a new name for the same old game. Enter 3PD, Third Party Development.
The only option, if we don't have the money, is to go down a third-party development type role where you get developers who come in and build it and we would rent the facilities from them.
Like PFI, the private sector pays the upfront costs of a new building and government pays them back. And like PFI, the payments would come from the day-to-day money meant for salaries and not the pot meant for buildings. In 2013, Health Minister Edwin Poots proposed 2 new health centres.
While there's funding to staff and equip these centres, there isn't the £80 million it will take to build them. Step forward, the private sector.
For the new centres in Newry and his own constituency in Lisburn, Mr Poots proposed using 3PD. Before the Department of Health could go ahead with the third-party development idea, it had to check whether it was value for money for the taxpayer. Spotlight has obtained a summary of the department's findings, and one thing in particular really jumps out. The Minister Edwin Poots is told that to go ahead with the idea of renting the buildings back from a private developer will be £8 million more expensive than paying up front. Now, when a minister wants civil servants to go ahead with an option which doesn't represent value for money for the taxpayer, he has to personally order them to do so. It's called a ministerial direction, and it happens quite rarely. But that's exactly what Edwin Poots did in this case. Mr Poots said he selected the more expensive 3PD because cash was tight and he wanted the buildings quickly, ready by 2016. So I went to see the results. Not only had neither building been finished, they hadn't even been started. Mr Poots had overridden civil servants and gone for the more expensive option, 3PD, to get the buildings more quickly. But that didn't happen. We asked Mr Poots whether he should have chosen the cheaper option. Mr Poots didn't respond. Back in Belfast, the Invest NI tale had a couple of twists. First of all, we remembered it wasn't only a very expensive office block, it's a film set as well. Here's the BBC hit drama Line of Duty, where the police station is the lobby of the Invest NI building. So, we asked to film inside as well. We wanted to see what all that taxpayers' money had been spent on. We were told no, we would be too disruptive for the staff working inside. Alright, so what about the weekend? Would that be any better? Again, the answer came back a flat no. So we weren't allowed inside, but it didn't stop us looking inside the books. As well as Invest NI paying the most expensive rent ever in Belfast, there was a second twist. In 2013, then Finance Minister Sammy Wilson said Invest NI could stop paying rent and finally own their own building.
Currently, Invest NI leases the building through a PFI contract, and Invest NI can now buy back its headquarter building at a very competitive price. We are estimating that we will be saving nearly £3 million per year on what we've been paying on rent.
But Sammy Wilson only told some of the story. That's because to put up the building at the start of the PFI deal, the developers had borrowed the money. They still owe £22 million. And like many property debts here, after the crash, it was owed to the Irish bad bank NAMA. What Sammy Wilson didn't say was that to get the building, Invest NI had to take on that debt.
It was the quid pro quo. They got the building, but they also had to assume the debt. They're on the hook for £22 million. What's interesting is what happens to the debt thereafter.
Spotlight understands Invest NI's debt was one of those sold by NAMA to the US investment fund Cerberus in 2014.
Spotlight can reveal that that debt is currently costing the taxpayer in Northern Ireland £1 million a year in interest, and that interest is being paid to the US investment fund Cerberus.
In 2013, Alistair Hamilton indicated to his board he hoped to settle this high-interest debt. Invest NI emailed Arlene Foster and said the same. But 4 years on, and millions to Cerberus later, that hasn't happened. Why not?
If you were in charge of Invest NI, what would you be seeking to do in order to deal with this debt?
I would be working as hard as I could to try and refinance it while interest rates are still low. In principle, it shouldn't be that difficult.
Alistair Hamilton told us the matter was continuing to be assessed and commercially sensitive, but he didn't say why the debt hadn't been settled.
He was very clear to his board about what should happen. And yes, it's a fundamental unanswered question. Why has it not happened?
Alistair Hamilton said that by buying the PFI company which owned the building, Invest NI saved millions. He said our scattershot investigation would damage the potential to achieve further savings. Sammy Wilson hadn't told the Assembly about the high interest debt. We asked him why. He didn't answer.
We're paying the interest off on the 22 million, so we have that millstone round our neck, and yet what Mr. Wilson outlined to the House bore no relationship to that reality.
Arlene Foster, Enterprise Minister when the building was bought, didn't answer questions either. Invest NI is still dealing with the legacy of its PFI contract. The general PFI experience has prompted debate. Is it wrong in principle, or can its problems be ironed out?
You might actually be better with a bucket in the middle of the ward catching the dripping rain than all of that money going into someone else's coffers.
But others believe a reform PFI is essential.
If you're not going to invest in your economy, we're going to be a third world economy.
Questions remain. Has the public sector given away too much profit? Have civil servants landed taxpayers with a bad deal? Will the hospital or the school be needed in the same way in 30 years? And can we afford to pay for them before we pay nurses and teachers' salaries? Because PFI decisions travel through time. This year alone, our PFI payments are £260 million.
That's on the order of serious policies like water charging or devolving corporation tax that we've discussed for a decade, but yet we've managed to run up a similar cost without even noticing.
A cost that will be with us until the final instalment, decades from now. When that last payment is made, I will be 62.